The package arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Uncle Marcus's funeral. I wasn't expecting anything. After all, Uncle Marcus had been the type of relative who existed mainly in old family photographs and occasional holiday phone calls. The cardboard box sat on my front porch, weathered and battered as if it had traveled much farther than the return address in Maine suggested. I brought it inside, noticing immediately how the contents shifted with a peculiar weight. The shipping label was written in my uncle's distinctive scrawl, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who spent more time writing than sleeping. The postmark dated it 3 days before his death. That detail made my hands tremble as I cut through the packing tape. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of brown paper and bubble wrap, was a leather-bound journal that looked like it had survived several wars. The leather was cracked and weathered, with strange symbols burned into its spine. A letter, sealed with deep red wax, lay on top. "Dear Nicholas, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. I've spent 30 years debating whether to bring another soul into this world I've discovered, but circumstances have forced my hand. You're the only one I can trust with this inheritance, though I pray you'll forgive me for the burden it brings. The journal you hold contains 3 decades of my life's work. To the outside world, I was a reclusive writer living in a lighthouse on the Maine coast. The truth is far more complicated. I was a cryptid investigator documenting and studying creatures that science claims don't exist. You probably think I've lost my mind. I wouldn't blame you. But before you dismiss this as the ravings of your crazy uncle, I ask one thing. Look at page 47 of the journal. What you'll find there is proof that our world is far stranger than anyone suspects. There's an office waiting for you, hidden in my old lighthouse. All my equipment, my files, everything you need to continue my work. The address and security codes are in the back of the journal. Time is critical, Nicholas. Something is coming, something I've tried to prevent. I'm sorry for dropping this in your lap, but you're the only one with the right combination of skills. Your background in forensic photography, your master's degree in cryptozoology. Yes, I kept track of your studies. And most importantly, your ability to see what others miss. Be careful who you trust. And whatever you do, don't let Division 7 find you. Uncle Marcus. P.S. If you hear scratching at your window tonight, do not open the curtains. My hands were shaking as I set down the letter. Uncle Marcus had always been eccentric, but this was different. This felt real in a way that made my stomach twist. I opened the journal to page 47, and my world shifted permanently. The page contained a photograph, meticulously taped to the paper and surrounded by detailed notes. It showed a creature that simply couldn't exist. But I had seen it before. 3 months ago, I had captured something similar on my trail camera while doing wildlife photography in the Berkshires. I'd convinced myself it was a camera malfunction or a trick of the light. The creature in both photos defied biological classification. 8 feet tall, with limbs that bent at impossible angles, and skin that seemed to shift like static on an old TV. But it was the eyes that made my blood run cold. Dozens of them, arranged in spiral patterns across what might have been its face. Uncle Marcus's handwriting filled the margins. Third encounter with Entity 47 shows signs of intelligence. Attempted communication through modified EMF reader. Temperature drops 15 degrees during encounters. Seems drawn to electrical equipment. Warning: do not attempt flash photography. Triggers aggressive response. The next few pages contained detailed anatomical sketches, behavior notes, and coordinates of sightings. This wasn't the work of a madman. These were scientific observations, methodically documented with the precision of a field researcher. As I flipped through the journal, more photos spilled out. Each one showed creatures that shouldn't exist, along with extensive notes about their habits, habitats, and hunting patterns. Some pages were stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. Others contained warnings scrawled in red ink. Never whistle at night, in the presence of Entity 23 inches and silver nitrate, effective as deterrent against tunnel dwellers. The final entry was dated just days before his death. The handwriting was shaky, urgent. They're getting closer. The pattern is accelerating. Everything we predicted is happening faster than expected. The barrier is thinning, and they know it. I have to reach the site before. The entry ended in a violent scratch across the page, the paper stained with rusty brown droplets. In the back of the journal, just as he'd promised, I found a set of coordinates and a series of numbers labeled Security Protocol. There was also a key taped to the final page, old and brass, with strange markings etched into its surface. A scratching sound came from my window. I froze, the journal clutched to my chest, remembering Uncle Marcus's postscript. The sound came again, more insistent this time, like something with too many claws was trying to get my attention. "Don't open the curtains," he had written. The scratching continued for exactly 7 minutes before stopping abruptly. In the silence that followed, I made my decision. I opened my laptop and booked a flight to Maine, my hands hovering over the keyboard as I thought about the life I was leaving behind. But the image of that creature and the memory of my own unexplained photograph wouldn't let me turn back. I had questions that needed answers, and a growing suspicion that Uncle Marcus's death wasn't from natural causes. As I packed my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me through the curtains, waiting to see what I would do with my inheritance. The next morning, I headed to Maine, the journal secure in my messenger bag, unaware that this was only the beginning of how I became a cryptid detective. The Maine coastline in October was a study in grays and silvers, like someone had painted the world in metallic watercolors. I followed the GPS coordinates from Uncle Marcus's journal, watching as civilized roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, then finally just tire tracks through dense pine forest. The lighthouse appeared suddenly through the fog, a white sentinel rising from the cliffs, its paint peeling from decades of salt air and storms. The keeper's cottage hunched beside it like a watchful guardian, windows dark and shuttered. This would have been my uncle's home for the past 30 years, though looking at it now, it seemed more fortress than house. I parked my rental car and approached the cottage, consulting the journal's security notes. Uncle Marcus had been paranoid about intruders, or maybe, given what I now knew, justifiably cautious. The front door had 3 locks, each requiring a different key from the ring I'd inherited. The brass key with the strange markings fit the final lock, but only after I aligned the etched symbols with corresponding marks on the door frame. The door opened with a sound like an exhale. The interior was dark, but as soon as I stepped inside, motion sensors hummed to life. Lights flickered on in sequence, revealing what at first glance looked like the command center of a particularly obsessive conspiracy theorist. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was looking at something far more organized and purposeful. The main room's walls were covered in maps, topographical, geological, and what appeared to be electromagnetic survey data. Red string connected various points, creating a complex web that centered on several hot spots across New England. Newspaper clippings filled the spaces between, headlines jumping out. Unexplained disappearances continue in White Mountains. Local farmer reports livestock mutilations. Authorities baffled. Missing hiker's case goes cold. Search called off. A massive desk dominated one corner, its surface covered in sophisticated monitoring equipment. Multiple screens displayed real-time data, weather patterns, seismic activity, and something labeled phase variance readings that meant nothing to me. A police scanner crackled quietly, cycling through emergency frequencies. But it was the specimen room that made me question everything I thought I knew about biology. A door marked lab led to a temperature-controlled chamber filled with specimen jars and preservation tanks. Each was meticulously labeled with Uncle Marcus's precise handwriting. Entity 47 tissue sample. Tunnel walker secretion. Wendigo fur fragment. Exercise extreme caution. Some of the samples seemed to move slightly when I looked directly at them. Others appeared to exist in more dimensions than should be possible, their edges blurring in ways that hurt my eyes. The computer terminal in the lab required another security code from the journal. As it booted up, I found myself staring at a database containing thousands of entries. Each documented a different creature, complete with habitat data, behavioral patterns, and threat assessments. Uncle Marcus had created a comprehensive taxonomy of things that shouldn't exist. A notification popped up on the screen. Weekly report due, transmission window, 11:47 p.m. to 12:13 a.m. I checked my watch, 11:23 p.m. Who was expecting these reports now that Uncle Marcus was gone? The specimen jars rattled slightly on their shelves. At first, I thought it was a small earthquake, but the seismic monitors showed no activity. The rattling grew stronger, and I noticed all the samples were vibrating in the same direction, toward the lighthouse. I found the lighthouse access door behind a bookshelf. It had been reinforced with steel and silver inlays, with warnings etched into the metal. Secure all samples before entry, and Protocol 7 required beyond this point. The journal mentioned Protocol 7, a specific sequence of actions involving salt lines, UV lights, and something called frequency shielding. As I gathered the required materials listed in the journal, a sound echoed through the cottage. Not the scratching from my window back home, but something deeper. It resonated in my chest cavity like the subwoofer of the world's largest speaker playing a note too low to properly hear. The specimens vibrated more intensely. One of the jars, containing what looked like black smoke with too many eyes, began to crack. I had a choice to make. The sun had set, and according to Uncle Marcus's notes, that made any investigation exponentially more dangerous. But the lighthouse was clearly active. I could see strange lights pulsing behind its windows, cycling through colors that didn't belong in nature. The journal had one final warning about the lighthouse. Never enter alone after dark unless absolutely necessary. If you must go up, take silver, take light, and most importantly, take the frequency shield. They are drawn to the beacon. It's not just a lighthouse, it's a doorway, and sometimes things try to come through. The specimen jar cracked further, and the black smoke inside began to take shape. The computers showed electromagnetic readings spiking off the charts. Whatever was happening in the lighthouse, it was building towards something. I grabbed the silver inlaid flashlight from Uncle Marcus's desk, powered up the frequency shield, a device that looked like a cross between a radar gun and a music synthesizer, and approached the lighthouse door. The journal had mentioned that Uncle Marcus was working on preventing something from crossing over. Looking at the readings on the monitors and the increasingly aggressive movement of the specimens, I had a sinking feeling that his preventive measures might have died with him. As I input the door's security code, the black smoke specimen jar finally shattered. I slammed the lab door shut, just as something with too many appendages began to unfurl inside. The lighthouse door clicked open, revealing a spiral staircase disappearing upward into darkness. From above came a sound like reality tearing at the seams. This, I realized, was where my real education as a cryptid detective would begin. I never made it to the top of the lighthouse that night. The frequency shield sparked and died halfway up the spiral staircase, and the darkness above began to move in ways that defied physics. I retreated, sealing the reinforced door behind me just as something massive slammed against it from the other side. The impact left dents in the steel, pushed outward as if something was trying to escape the lighthouse rather than enter it. I spent that first night in Uncle Marcus's study, surrounded by monitoring equipment and specimen containers, trying to make sense of his research. Around 3:27 a.m., the lighthouse went quiet. The specimens stopped vibrating. Everything returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a house full of cryptid research. The next morning, I was awoken by an alert from Uncle Marcus's computer system. A new case had been automatically flagged based on parameters he'd set up. 3 hikers missing in New Hampshire's White Mountains, all disappearing from the same 5-mile radius over the past week. The local authorities were calling it a series of unfortunate accidents. The hikers had probably gotten lost, they said, or fallen victim to exposure, but Uncle Marcus's database told a different story. His notes documented similar disappearances in the same area every 7 years, going back to the 1800s. Each cluster of vanishings happened during the waning gibbous moon, exactly like now. I packed Uncle Marcus's field kit, silver-tipped stakes, UV lights, thermal cameras, and various sensors I didn't yet understand. The journal's entry on Wendigos was extensive, filled with warnings and protocols. Wendigo encounters require extreme caution. They are intelligent hunters that play with perception. What you see is never what's really there. They mimic voices, create false trails, and manipulate their prey's sense of direction. Most dangerous during the hunger moon phase. Silver nitrate irritates them. UV light reveals their true form. Do not, under any circumstances, respond if you hear someone calling your name in the woods. The White Mountains were a 4-hour drive from the lighthouse. I spent the time listening to police scanner recordings from the area, noting patterns that the authorities had missed. Each disappearance was preceded by unusual animal behavior. Birds falling silent, pets refusing to go outside, deer moving in the wrong direction for the season. I arrived at the trailhead just before 2 p.m. The parking lot was empty except for a single Forest Service vehicle. A middle-aged Native American man was posting warning signs about recent bear activity. He watched me unload my equipment with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what I was looking for. "You're Marcus Fletcher's nephew," he said. It wasn't a question. "How did you?" He helped us place the wards 21 years ago during the last cycle. "I'm John Redcrow, tribal liaison for the Forest Service. Your uncle was supposed to be here for this cycle. We've been trying to reach him." My throat tightened. "He passed away last week." John's face darkened. "Then the binding is breaking. The old protections won't hold through another 7-year cycle without renewal. That's why it's hunting so actively now. The Wendigo. That's the simplified name for it. Our word for this being is much older. It's not just a creature. It's a spirit of corruption, of hunger that can never be satisfied. Your uncle understood that. He helped us combine our traditional wards with his more technological approaches." John reached into his truck and pulled out a worn leather map case. "Marcus left this with me last time, said to give it to whoever came in his place. I'm guessing that's you now." The case contained detailed maps of the area, marked with symbols I recognized from Uncle Marcus's journal. Some locations were marked in red ink, others in what looked like dried blood. The caves, John pointed to a series of markings. "That's where the old wards are anchored. But you'll have to move fast. Sunset is at 6:47 p.m. You don't want to be on these trails after dark, not until the wards are renewed." I spread out the maps on my car's hood, comparing them to Uncle Marcus's notes. The disappearances formed a pattern, a spiral moving inward toward a specific cave system. The caves themselves were covered in ancient pictographs, according to the journal, warnings about the being that hunted here. "I'll come with you," John offered, but I saw the fear in his eyes. "Marcus would have wanted you to have backup." Before I could respond, a scream echoed through the mountains, a perfect imitation of a human voice calling for help. But it came from 3 different directions at once, an impossible acoustical trick that made my teeth vibrate. The hunt had already begun. John crossed himself, then made another gesture I didn't recognize. "It knows we're here. It remembers the last time we bound it." Marcus said if the wards ever failed completely, something worse than the Wendigo would be able to cross over, something it was just a precursor to. I checked Uncle Marcus's monitoring equipment. The readings were similar to what I'd seen in the lighthouse. Reality itself seemed to be getting thin around us. The boundary between what should and shouldn't exist was starting to blur. The scream came again, closer this time. Through the thermal camera's display, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. Something impossibly tall and thin, with too many joints in its limbs. The temperature around it registered at -40 degrees Fahrenheit. I grabbed the field kit and the maps. Whatever Uncle Marcus had been preparing for, whatever he'd tried to prevent, I had a feeling this case was about more than just missing hikers. The Wendigo was only part of the picture, a symptom of something bigger. The cave entrance was 2 miles up the mountain trail. According to my uncle's notes, we had about 4 hours until sunset to find the ward anchors and renew the bindings. After that, we'd be dealing with a fully unleashed Wendigo in its own hunting grounds. As we started up the trail, all the birds went silent at once. John mumbled a prayer in his native language. I checked the silver stakes in my pack and tried to remember everything I'd read about Wendigo encounters. The real question wasn't whether we'd find what we were looking for. The question was whether we'd survive finding it. The Wendigo case changed everything. John and I barely made it out of those caves alive, but we succeeded in renewing the wards using a combination of his tribal knowledge and Uncle Marcus's technical equipment. I still have nightmares about what we saw in those final moments before sunset. The true form of the creature, all twisted limbs and ancient hunger, caught in the beam of the UV lights as the binding took hold. But that's a story for another time. 3 days after returning to the lighthouse, I received my first email from Rodriguez. It arrived at 3:33 a.m., routed through what seemed like every anonymous server on the planet. Subject: MF Contingency Protocol Alpha. To the nephew. Your uncle's death wasn't natural, neither was the timing. You need to be careful. They're watching the lighthouse. Check the basement freezer behind the false wall. Bring thermal imaging equipment. Don't trust standard electronics. Error PS. Delete this immediately. They can track standard communications. The message disappeared from my screen 10 seconds after I opened it, leaving behind a small program that scrubbed all traces of its existence from my computer. The basement freezer turned out to be a clever disguise for a secure communications center. Behind the frozen specimens, some of which may or may not have still been alive, a false wall opened into a room filled with specialized equipment. A modified ham radio took up one corner, its dials marked with symbols instead of numbers. Next to it sat something that looked like an old teletype machine crossed with a crystal radio set. Following Rodriguez's instructions, I powered up the thermal imaging device before activating anything else. Through its display, I could see text scrolling across the teletype's paper in cold blue letters that were invisible to the naked eye. Network status: active current operators, 23, threat level, red latest advisory, maintain blackout protocols. I found the transmission switch marked with Uncle Marcus's symbol, a combination of geometric shapes that I'd seen throughout his journal. The network crackled to life. About time you found this place. The voice through the speaker was female, with a slight Argentine accent. I'm Rodriguez. Your uncle was my mentor 20 years ago. What do you mean his death wasn't natural? Marcus was investigating something bigger than individual cryptids. He found a pattern. They're all becoming more active, more visible. The barriers between worlds are wearing thin. Division 7 tried to shut him up. Division 7, government agency, technically doesn't exist. They want to weaponize what we study. Your uncle refused to cooperate. There was a pause filled with static. 3 other investigators have gone dark in the past month. We're getting reports of increased activity worldwide. Something's coming, kid. The thermal display flickered, showing other signatures joining our conversation. Each one appeared as a different colored heat signature, forming a web of connections across what I assumed was a map of the world. Welcome to the network, Rodriguez continued. We're what stands between humanity and things they're not ready to know about. Each of us specializes in different entities. Marcus was our expert on interdimensional incursions. I handle aquatic cryptids in the South Pacific. Chen focuses on urban legends in Asia. Montgomery works with folklore manifestations in Europe. And what's my specialty supposed to be? You tell us. That Wendigo case, binding a Class 3 entity on your first outing, that's not beginner's luck. You've got your uncle's gift for seeing what's really there, but you need training. The old protocols aren't working as well anymore. The creatures are adapting. A series of images began printing from the teletype. Photographs of familiar cryptids behaving in new ways, charts showing spikes in supernatural activity, and maps marked with incident clusters. 3 rules, Rodriguez said. 1. Never investigate alone unless absolutely necessary. 2. Report everything to the network, no matter how small. 3. Watch for Division 7. They're getting desperate. That makes them dangerous. Why desperate? Because they know what's coming. Same thing your uncle died trying to prevent. The boundaries between worlds aren't just thinning, they're degrading. Every cryptid we track is like a finger poking through the fabric of reality, and now something much bigger is pushing against that fabric. The thermal display erupted with new signatures, network members joining the conversation from around the world. Names and locations scrolled past. Dr. Wei in Hong Kong tracking something in the subway tunnels, Professor Santos in Brazil reporting increased activity in the Amazon, Father McKenna in Ireland dealing with ancient beings awakening under stone circles. "This is the real inheritance Marcus left you," Rodriguez said. "Not just the lighthouse or his research. He left you a place in this network because he knew you'd see the truth. The question is, are you ready to see how deep this really goes?" Before I could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the lighthouse. The specimens in the lab above started rattling again. The thermal display showed multiple heat signatures approaching through the woods, human-shaped but moving wrong. Division 7. Rodriguez's voice was tight with concern. "They're making their move. Remember what I said about being desperate. Get to the lighthouse, now. The beacon isn't just for warning ships anymore. It's holding something back, and they want to shut it down." The basement lights flickered. Through the thermal imaging device, I saw shapes moving in the darkness that had nothing to do with the approaching agents. Something was wrong with the space between spaces. "Network going dark," Rodriguez said. "Standard protocols suspended. Trust no one outside secure channels. And kid, whatever you do, don't let them take the lighthouse. What's on the other side has been waiting a very long time to get through." The communication system shut down as footsteps echoed from above. Division 7 had breached the cottage, but they weren't my biggest concern. The lighthouse beacon had started pulsing in that wrong-colored light again, and this time, something was answering its call. I had exactly 47 seconds to make a decision before Division 7 reached the basement. The thermal imaging showed 8 agents sweeping the cottage above, their movements precise and coordinated, but their body temperatures were wrong, too cold, hovering just above freezing. Uncle Marcus's journal had warned about this. Division 7 enhances their agents. Some aren't entirely human anymore. The trade-off for superhuman abilities is a decreased core temperature. It makes them nearly invisible to most cryptids, but you can spot them with thermal imaging. I grabbed the most crucial research materials in Uncle Marcus's field kit, then activated what the journal called the Omega Protocol. Red lights began flashing throughout the basement as hidden machinery hummed to life. I sealed the basement door just as the first agent reached it. "Target is in the basement," a voice reported above. "Standing by for..." The voice cut off in static. Through the thermal imaging device, I watched as reality twisted in on itself. The basement's false wall didn't just slide away, it folded through dimensions that shouldn't exist, revealing a tunnel that Uncle Marcus had prepared for exactly this scenario. As I stepped through, I heard the Division 7 agents breaking down the basement door. The tunnel shouldn't have been possible. It curved through spaces that made my eyes hurt, leading away from the lighthouse at angles that defied geometry. Uncle Marcus's notes called it a probability tunnel. A path that existed in the spaces between traditional space-time. I emerged half a mile away, inside an abandoned fishing shack. Through its salt-crusted windows, I could see the lighthouse pulsing with that strange light. Division 7 vehicles surrounded it, but the agents weren't proceeding up to the beacon. Something was keeping them at bay. My modified phone buzzed. A message from Rodriguez on our secure channel. Check the lunar charts, then check the leyline convergence maps in Marcus's journal. It's not just your lighthouse, they're all activating. I pulled up the data on Uncle Marcus's tablet. Across the world, places of power were lighting up with the same strange energy. Stone circles in England, ancient pyramids in South America, certain skyscrapers in Hong Kong that Wei had warned were built on old dragon lines. Every 7 years, just like the Wendigo's hunting cycle, these sites pulsed with power. But this time was different. The journal's final pages contained star charts and mathematical formulas I barely understood. Uncle Marcus had been tracking something, a convergence of cosmic and earthly cycles. The 7-year pattern was just part of a larger rhythm, like a cosmic clock ticking down to something. My phone buzzed again. Network reporting worldwide cryptid activity spikes. Chen says the Hong Kong subway system is literally bleeding. Montgomery reports stone circles in Ireland, singing in languages that drive listeners insane. Santos has lost contact with 3 research stations in the Amazon. Something's waking them all up at once. I spread out Uncle Marcus's maps on the shack's worn table. Each cryptid sighting over the past century was marked, forming patterns I hadn't noticed before. They weren't random appearances, they were test sites, points where the barrier between worlds was naturally weaker. The creatures weren't just crossing over, they were weakening the walls of reality like termites in wood. And now all the patterns were converging. The lighthouse beacon flared suddenly, painting the clouds above in colors that human eyes weren't meant to process. Division 7 agents retreated to their vehicles as something massive passed in front of the light, a shape that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our world allowed. My tablet lit up with alerts from across the network. Hong Kong, subway tunnels descending to impossible depths, entities emerging from platforms that don't exist. Ireland, stone circles rotating in ways that violate physics, time behaving strangely within 100-meter radius. Brazil, Amazon River flowing backward at multiple points, water contains unidentifiable organic compounds. New England, multiple reports. Wendigo barriers straining, all ward anchors showing signs of stress. Local wildlife exhibiting mass confusion. The pieces clicked together in my mind. Uncle Marcus hadn't just been tracking individual cryptids. He'd been mapping the points where reality itself was wearing thin. The lighthouse, the caves, all the places where creatures slipped through, they were pressure points in the membrane between worlds. And now something vast was pushing against all of them at once. A final message from Rodriguez appeared. Your uncle found out what's really on the other side. That's why they killed him. The cryptids aren't the invasion, they're the advanced scouts, the refugees. They're running from what's coming. Check the lighthouse basement's hidden room. The real hidden room. Marcus left something there for this moment. Combination is your birthday. Through the thermal scope, I watched Division 7 agents regrouping, preparing for another assault on the lighthouse. But they weren't just wearing tactical gear anymore. They were unloading equipment that looked ancient: carved staffs, stone tablets, artifacts that had no place in a modern military operation. They knew what was coming too. They weren't trying to stop it, they were trying to control it. I had to get back to that lighthouse. Whatever Uncle Marcus had hidden in that basement might be the only thing standing between our world and what waited on the other side of that thinning barrier. The cryptids we'd been tracking were just symptoms of a larger disease. Reality itself was under attack. And somewhere in that basement was the cure. The real question was whether I could reach it before Division 7 broke through, or before whatever was pushing against the walls of our world finally broke in. Getting back into the lighthouse proved impossible. Division 7 had the entire area locked down, and something far worse than agents now stalked the perimeter. Through Uncle Marcus's specially modified binoculars, I could see shapes moving between the trees that didn't fully exist in our dimension, like origami figures folding and unfolding through space. Rodriguez's next message redirected me to Boston. Marcus kept backups, hidden cache in Park Street Station, old maintenance tunnel, but hurry, underground's getting worse. Tunnel walkers hunting territory expanding. Chen says subway systems worldwide are connecting in ways that shouldn't be possible. I caught the last train into Boston, arriving at 9:13 p.m. The city felt wrong. Streets that should have been busy were eerily empty. The few people hurrying along kept their eyes down, moving quickly between pools of streetlight. They could sense something was off, even if they didn't know what. Park Street Station was one of America's oldest subway stops, and it felt it. The tiles walls sweated in the fluorescent lighting, and the air hung thick with more than just humidity. My thermal imaging equipment showed temperature variations that formed patterns, like something was writing messages in cold spots. The regular commuters unconsciously avoided certain areas of the platform, clustering together in what Uncle Marcus's journal would have called safe zones. They couldn't see the danger, but some primitive part of their brains could sense it. "You must be Marcus's nephew." The voice came from behind me, speaking in a whisper that somehow carried over the station noise. I turned to find a small Asian woman in a maintenance uniform that looked a little too clean. "I'm Lin Wei's Boston contact. Call me Mai." She led me through a maintenance door, then through another hidden behind some electrical panels. The tunnels grew older as we descended, transitioning from modern concrete to ancient brick, then to stone that looked older than the city itself. Your uncle marked these tunnels 20 years ago, Mai explained, pointing to symbols carved into the stone, protection sigils. They're failing now, like everything else. The tunnel walker's territory used to be just 2 stations. Now it hunts through the whole system. What exactly is the tunnel walker? A distant sound echoed through the tunnels, like footsteps, but wrong. Too many of them, moving in patterns that feet shouldn't move in. It's what happens when an urban legend feeds on enough fear to become real, Mai said, checking something that looked like a Geiger counter but measured temporal distortion. People alone in subway tunnels, hearing footsteps behind them that match their pace exactly. Turn around, nothing there. Speed up, it speeds up. Stop suddenly. The footsteps in the distance stopped. The tunnel walker was just one creature when your uncle first documented it, Mai continued. Now it's breeding, or splitting, or something worse. The boundaries between stories and reality are getting thin too, not just the walls between dimensions. We reached a junction where 3 tunnels met. Mai pointed to markings on the wall, recent ones spray painted in silver. Chen's warning symbols. This is new. The tunnels are moving, connecting. Subway systems that shouldn't link up are forming networks. Last week we had a commuter walk into a station in Boston and walk out in Hong Kong. The footsteps resumed, coming from all 3 tunnels now. Here, Mai pressed a brick that looked exactly like all the others. A section of wall swung inward, revealing a small room filled with filing cabinets. Marcus's backup cache, everything he thought was too dangerous to keep in one place. The files contained research too sensitive even for the lighthouse. Sketches of creatures that hurt the mind to look at. Photographs that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of your eye. And most importantly, a set of coordinates marking similar caches around the world. Your uncle knew this was coming, Mai said as I packed the most crucial files. He planned for it. All these caches, linked to ley lines, positioned at points of power. The lighthouse wasn't just holding something back, it was part of a larger machine. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by a sound like static mixed with whispering. We need to move. Mai checked her temporal distortion meter. Reality's getting thin here. When that happens, the walker can be in multiple tunnels at once. It's learning new tricks. We sealed the cache room and turned to leave, but stopped short. At the end of each tunnel stood a figure, too tall to be human, its proportions subtly wrong. As I watched through the thermal imaging, it existed in all 3 places simultaneously. Not copies, but the same being occupying multiple spaces at once. Don't run, Mai whispered. It wants you to run. The figures took a step forward, moving in perfect synchronization. In the thermal imaging, their heat signatures formed patterns like the ones I'd seen in the cold spots on the platform, a language written in temperature variations. Your uncle found a way to communicate with it, Mai said. That's what Division 7 wanted, not just to contain these beings, but to control them, to use them. The figures took another step. The air began to buzz with that same, wrong-colored energy I'd seen at the lighthouse. The cache, I realized, it's not just files, it's part of whatever Uncle Marcus was building, a network of connected points. Like a fence, Mai nodded. Or a cage. But for something much bigger than the walker. The figures were closer now. Through the thermal imaging, I could see their true form starting to bleed through into our reality, a geometry of limbs and angles that hurt my mind to look at. Run, Mai said, contradicting her earlier warning. Get to the next cache. I'll hold it here. She pulled something from her maintenance belt that looked like a cross between a flare gun and a tuning fork. How? Your uncle wasn't the only one preparing for this. We all have our roles to play. She aimed the device at the approaching figures. The next cache is in New York, Grand Central. Find Rodriguez's contact there, and Nicholas. Yes. When you find what Marcus was building, when you understand what it's really for, you'll have to make a choice. The same choice he faced. The figures were almost upon us. Mai's device began to hum at a frequency that made my teeth hurt. What choice? Whether to close the doors between worlds, she said, or open them wider. I ran as Mai activated her device, filling the tunnels with that impossible light. Behind me, I heard the tunnel walker's footsteps multiply and divide, changing rhythm as it encountered something it didn't expect. The choice Mai mentioned haunted me as I made my way to street level. Uncle Marcus had died protecting his secret. Now I had to decide what to do with it, if I could piece it together in time. The next cache waited in New York, and with it, hopefully, more answers about what was really hiding in the spaces between spaces, and why both Division 7 and the cryptids themselves seemed to be counting down to something that felt suspiciously like the end of the world. I made it to Grand Central Terminal just before midnight, my mind still reeling from what I'd witnessed in Boston. May's last message had come through an hour ago. She'd survived her encounter with the tunnel walker, but the creature had changed afterward, becoming something new. The subway tunnels were now experiencing what she called spatial collapse. Platforms existing in multiple cities at once, trains arriving at stations decades before they departed. Grand Central felt like a palace holding its breath. The vast ceiling with its celestial map drew my eyes upward, and I noticed something that made me freeze. The stars in the painting were moving, not just twinkling, but realigning themselves into patterns that matched the diagrams in Uncle Marcus's journal. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to find a janitor wheeling a cleaning cart, his uniform just a little too pressed for someone working the midnight shift. Rodriguez sent me, he said quietly. Name's Jackson, former Division 7, before I learned what they were really doing. He led me to a maintenance elevator that shouldn't have existed according to the building's blueprints. As we descended, Jackson explained. Division 7 started after World War II. The government had encountered things during the war, things they couldn't explain, things that showed up in Nazi bunkers and Japanese temples. They realized there were forces out there humanity wasn't ready for. The elevator opened into a vast chamber that looked like a cross between a nuclear bunker and a medieval library. Rows of filing cabinets stretched into darkness, interspersed with glass containers holding things that moved in ways that matter shouldn't. At first, they just wanted to contain it, Jackson continued, leading me past specimens that made the ones in Uncle Marcus's lab look tame. But then they started experimenting, trying to weaponize what they found. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear arms, it was about who could control these entities first. He stopped at a section marked Project Threshold. This is what got your uncle killed. Jackson pulled out a file filled with photographs and reports. Marcus discovered what Division 7 was really working toward. They weren't trying to stop the incursions or seal the barriers between worlds. They wanted to break them down completely. The photos showed facilities across the country, underground bases built on ley line intersections, massive machines designed to amplify supernatural energy. In one image, Division 7 agents channeled some kind of force through a captive cryptid, trying to tear open a hole in reality itself. They think they can control what comes through, Jackson said, disgust evident in his voice. They've been manipulating events, weakening the walls between dimensions systematically. Every cryptid sighting, every supernatural event, they're not just studying them, they're orchestrating them. Security footage showed Uncle Marcus confronting Division 7 officials just days before his death. The timestamp matched the date of the final entry in his journal. Marcus found out they were using his research to map weak points in reality. All those studies of cryptid behavior, all those carefully documented encounter patterns. They used it to figure out where to plant their devices. They're treating our dimension like a dam, looking for stress points where they can break through. But why? I asked, examining a map that showed hundreds of Division 7 facilities positioned along ley lines. What do they think they'll gain? Power. Jackson's voice was grim. They believe whatever's on the other side will give them control over reality itself. They've made contact with something that's been promising them knowledge, technology, abilities beyond human comprehension. But they're idiots. They can't see they're being played. He led me deeper into the facility, past rooms filled with humming equipment and containers holding swirling darkness. Your uncle built a failsafe, a network of devices and structures positioned at key points around the world. The lighthouse was just one piece of it. Each cache contains part of the blueprint. We reached a heavy door marked with familiar symbols, the same ones I'd seen in Uncle Marcus's journal. Inside was another cache, this one containing not just files, but pieces of equipment that looked ancient and modern at the same time. Division 7 thinks they're the ones in control of this situation, Jackson said as I examined the cache's contents. They think they're the ones weakening reality, but Marcus figured out the truth. We're not the ones in control. We never were. Those things out there, the cryptids, they're not trying to break in, they're trying to warn us. A distant alarm began to sound. Jackson tensed. They're here. They must have tracked you from Boston. He quickly helped me gather the most crucial materials. There's an escape tunnel behind that panel. It'll lead you to a safe house. Rodriguez's people will meet you there. What about you? I'll hold them off. Buy you some time. He pulled out an ID card that sparked with strange energy. Division 7 isn't the only ones who can enhance their agents. As I slipped into the escape tunnel, I heard Jackson confronting the Division 7 team. Through a gap in the panel, I watched as his form shifted, becoming something that reminded me of the tunnel walker, but controlled, directed, purposeful. The files I'd gathered contained the truth about Uncle Marcus's death, about Division 7's real agenda, and most importantly, about what was really trying to break through into our world. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't in any of the official documents. It was a personal note written in Uncle Marcus's hand the day before he died. If you're reading this, Nicholas, then they got to me before I could finish it. The network isn't just for protection, it's a choice, a way to either seal the barriers permanently or tear them down completely. Division 7 thinks they're in control, but they're pawns. The real players in this game are so far beyond our comprehension that even the cryptids fear them. Find the rest of the caches, complete the network, and when the time comes, make the right choice, the one I couldn't make. P.S. Watch the stars. When they align into the pattern from your childhood nightmares, you'll know it's starting. And Nicholas, I'm sorry for what you'll have to become to finish this. The note ended there, but its implications were clear. Uncle Marcus hadn't just been studying cryptids. He'd been preparing for a war. A war that was about to begin, whether humanity was ready or not. And somewhere in the darkness between dimensions, something was watching, waiting to see which side I would choose. The safe house turned out to be an abandoned church in the Bronx, its Gothic architecture hiding technology that would have made NASA envious. Rodriguez's team had converted the bell tower into a monitoring station, tracking supernatural activity across the eastern seaboard. Your uncle spent a lot of time here, Dr. Helena Santos said as she helped me analyze the files from Grand Central. The Brazilian cryptozoologist had flown in specifically to meet me. This is where he first made contact with the Elder One. She led me to the church basement, where the pews had been replaced with banks of equipment. But it was the center of the room that caught my attention. A perfect circle of stones, each carved with symbols that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Marcus discovered that certain geometric arrangements could facilitate communication across dimensional boundaries, Helena explained, but not like Division 7's brute force approach. This was more like tuning into a frequency, listening to what was already being broadcast. She inserted a flash drive into one of the computers and a video began playing. The timestamp showed it was recorded 2 months before Uncle Marcus's death. The camera showed this same basement, the stone circle illuminated by candlelight. Uncle Marcus sat cross-legged in the center, surrounded by equipment that measured everything from electromagnetic fields to quantum fluctuations. His voice was steady as he spoke into a digital recorder. Test 47, attempting contact using modified frequency protocols. Previous attempts resulted in temporary dimensional bleeding. New containment measures in place. He activated something that looked like a tuning fork crossed with a Tesla coil. The air in the circle began to ripple. Energy signatures matching previous successful contact. Beginning transmission. What happened next made my blood run cold. Uncle Marcus began speaking in a language that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. The cameras flickered, and for a moment, the circle of stones seemed to contain something vast, a presence that existed in more dimensions than human minds could process. Then it spoke back. The audio was distorted, but snippets came through clearly. The barrier's thin as planned, your kind not ready, but choice must be made. Weapons they build will draw them through. Network must be completed. Sorry, old friend, but your death necessary for next phase. The video ended abruptly. Helena's hands were shaking as she turned off the monitor. Marcus made contact with something ancient, she said. Something that had been watching our world for millennia. It showed him what was coming. Not just Division 7's attempts to breach dimensional barriers, but what those breaches would attract. She spread out a series of photographs on a nearby table. They showed similar stone circles around the world, each connected to a piece of Uncle Marcus's network. Your uncle built his device network not just to contain incursions, but to communicate with whatever's on the other side. The Elder One warned him about entities far worse than the cryptids we track, beings that devour entire realities. Division 7's experiments are attracting their attention. A computer alarm began blaring. One of Rodriguez's technicians called us over to a monitor showing worldwide supernatural activity. "It's happening," Helena whispered, just like Marcus predicted. The display showed energy spikes at every known weak point in reality. The cryptids weren't just becoming more active. They were retreating, running from something. Dimensional barriers were straining worldwide. Your uncle knew he had to die, Helena continued. The Elder One showed him that his death would set certain events in motion. The network needed a new operator, someone with the right bloodline, the right preparation, someone who could make the choice he couldn't. She handed me a final piece of evidence, a video file dated the day before Uncle Marcus died. In it, my uncle sat in his lighthouse study, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His voice was tired but determined. "Nicholas, if you're watching this, then everything is proceeding as the Elder One foresaw. I've spent my life preparing you for this moment, though you didn't know it. Those nightmares you had as a child, the ones about stars moving into impossible patterns, that was them reaching out, making sure you could perceive what was coming. The network I built isn't just a defense system, it's a choice. When fully activated, it can either seal our reality permanently, cutting us off from all other dimensions, including the ones where these entities exist, or it can open everything completely. The Elder One showed me that isolation might be our only hope for survival, but the cost..." He paused, emotion breaking through his professional demeanor. "The cost would be losing everything we've learned about what exists beyond our world. All the knowledge, all the potential. We'd be alone in a universe suddenly much smaller than we knew. But the alternative..." A sound like reality tearing made the camera shake. "They're coming, Nicholas. The ones that even the Elder Ones fear. Division 7 thinks they can control what comes through their manufactured breaches, but they have no idea what they're dealing with. The cryptids we've been studying, they're nothing compared to what's stirring in the spaces between spaces. Complete the network, find the remaining caches, and when the time comes, make the choice I couldn't. The Elder One will reach out to you just as it did to me. Listen to what it shows you. And Nicholas, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the burden I'm placing on you, but you're the only one who can finish this." The video ended. Helena was watching me carefully. "The network is nearly complete," she said, "but Division 7 is getting desperate. They know what's coming too, but they think they can bargain with it, control it." The church's equipment suddenly spiked, readings going off the charts. Through the basement windows, we could see the stars beginning to move into familiar patterns, the same ones from my childhood nightmares. The choice Uncle Marcus mentioned was coming sooner than anyone had expected. And somewhere in the darkness between dimensions, both the Elder One and something far worse were waiting to see what I would do. The network's monitoring stations lit up like a Christmas tree gone wrong. Every screen in the church basement showed the same thing. Reality was coming apart at the seams. "Reports coming in worldwide," Helena announced, coordinating with operators across the globe. Hong Kong's subway system has completely detached from normal space-time. The Wendigo barriers in New Hampshire are failing. Stone circles in Ireland are broadcasting some kind of signal on frequencies that shouldn't exist. Rodriguez's voice crackled over our secure channel. Situation critical in the Pacific. The things we've been tracking in the deep trenches are surfacing. They're running from something down there, something worse. The church's equipment picked up a familiar resonance, the same energy signature I'd seen in Uncle Marcus's video. The Elder One was trying to make contact. It's choosing now to reach out, Helena said, helping me set up the communication array, just like your uncle's video predicted. We activated the stone circle, and reality rippled. The presence that filled the room was vast, ancient, and terrified. It spoke in that impossible language, but somehow I understood. Division 7 has succeeded. Barriers weakened beyond critical point. They come. Images flooded my mind. Beings that existed in geometries reality wasn't meant to hold. Entities that consumed entire dimensions, leaving nothing but void in their wake. The cryptids we'd been studying were like cats compared to these cosmic tigers. Your kind's weapons draw their attention. The experiments, the breaches, all beacons in the dark. Through the network's monitors, we watched as Division 7 facilities around the world activated massive machines, their final attempt to control what they'd started. But they didn't understand. They were children playing with matches, unaware they were standing in a pool of gasoline. The network, I said to the presence, Uncle Marcus's network, can it still seal the barriers? If completed. Final pieces scattered. Hidden from those who would stop it, but cost remains. The cost, isolation, cutting our dimension off from all others, losing not just the horrors but all the wonders we'd discovered beyond our reality. A technician burst into the room, multiple Division 7 teams converging on our location. They know we're here. Helena pulled up satellite footage. Black vehicles were approaching from all directions, but they weren't the only things moving through the city streets. Shadows crawled where shadows shouldn't exist. The air rippled with wrong colors. Time short. Others prepare final assault. Division 7 opens doors they cannot close. Through the basement windows, we could see the stars continuing their impossible dance. The constellations were forming patterns I remembered from childhood nightmares, patterns I now understood were warnings. How long do we have? I asked the presence. Hours, maybe less. Network must be completed. Final pieces hidden in places of power. The Elder One shared more images. A cave system deep beneath the painted desert. An abandoned lighthouse off the coast of Nova Scotia, a forgotten subway platform under Berlin. Each location held a piece of Uncle Marcus's device network. We'll never reach them all in time, Helena said, but I was already formulating a plan. The network, I said, our network of investigators. We can coordinate teams to retrieve all the pieces simultaneously. I reached out through our secure channels. Chen's team could handle the Berlin location. Rodriguez had people near Nova Scotia. Dr. Wei could coordinate the Asian sites. Montgomery's European group was already mobilizing. Division 7 will try to stop us, Helena warned. They've got teams watching all these locations. They are deceived. Believe entities can be controlled. Bargains made. But these beings do not bargain, they consume. Through the network's monitors, we watched as Division 7's attempts to control the incursions backfired spectacularly. Their enhanced agents were being overwhelmed by forces they couldn't comprehend. The very abilities they'd engineered to fight cryptids made them more visible to these greater entities. A series of explosions rocked the church. Division 7 had arrived. Go, I will hold them here. The Elder One's presence expanded, filling the basement with that impossible geometry. Helena and I grabbed the essential equipment and headed for the secret tunnel system that connected to the city's older subway lines. Which piece are we going after? She asked as we descended. The most important one, I said, checking Uncle Marcus's final notes. The Master Control Unit. The piece that can activate the entire network at once. Where? The lighthouse. My lighthouse. The one place Division 7 hasn't been able to breach. I showed her Uncle Marcus's final diagram. The beacon isn't just holding something back, it's protecting the core of the entire network. As we moved through the tunnels, our phones lit up with updates from around the world. Chen reporting massive dimensional breaches in Asia. Rodriguez tracking something impossibly large moving through the Atlantic. Montgomery's team going dark as stone circles throughout Europe activated simultaneously. The stars above were almost in position. Whatever was coming would arrive soon. The race to complete Uncle Marcus's network had begun, but even if we succeeded, I still had to make the choice. He couldn't seal our dimension away forever or risk everything on the slim hope that humanity could face what was coming. The weight of that decision pressed down on me as we made our way through the darkness, heading for what we hoped was salvation. Behind us, New York streets filled with things that shouldn't exist, while above, the stars continued their ancient warning. Time was running out. The journey back to Maine was a nightmare of shifting realities. Normal transportation was impossible. The airports were closed due to what the media was calling unprecedented atmospheric phenomena, and the highways were clogged with people fleeing the cities, trying to escape things they couldn't understand. Helena and I traveled through Uncle Marcus's probability tunnels, those impossible spaces between spaces. The network kept us updated on the deteriorating situation. Berlin team reporting success. Control node secured. Nova Scotia lighthouse reached. Component recovered. Asian teams, signal lost. Repeated attempts at contact failed. European stone circles fully activated. Montgomery says the frequency is changing. The world was coming apart faster than anyone had predicted. Division 7's final push to breach dimensional barriers had worked better than they'd intended, and far worse than they'd imagined. The entities they'd thought they could control were just the tip of a cosmic iceberg, and now something vast and hungry was pushing through the cracks they'd made in reality. We emerged from the probability tunnel half a mile from my lighthouse. The scene that greeted us defied description. The sky had transformed into something that hurt to look at. Colors that shouldn't exist swirled in patterns that suggested geometries beyond human comprehension. The lighthouse beacon pulsed with that strange light, but now I understood it wasn't just a warning. It was the heart of Uncle Marcus's network, holding back the tide of what waited between dimensions. Division 7 forces surrounded the lighthouse, but they weren't trying to get in anymore. They were trying to survive. Their enhanced agents fought against shapes that shifted and twisted through reality, advanced scouts for something much worse that was still coming. The stars, Helena whispered, pointing upward. The constellations had almost aligned into that pattern from my childhood nightmares. When they finished their dance, the barriers between dimensions would be at their weakest. Whatever was coming would have its best chance to break through completely. We made our way toward the lighthouse, using Uncle Marcus's equipment to avoid the worst of the fighting. The cryptids we'd studied now seemed almost tame compared to what was manifesting. These new entities existed in more dimensions than our reality could handle, their forms bleeding through in ways that made my mind recoil. The Elder One's presence touched my consciousness. Final moments approach. Network nearly complete, but greatest challenge remains. Through the chaos, I could see what it meant. The lighthouse wasn't just protecting the master control unit, it was protecting something else. Something Uncle Marcus had discovered in his communications with the Elder One. We reached the lighthouse's base. The door recognized me, symbols aligning automatically. Inside, the monitoring equipment showed the full scope of what was happening. Every weak point in reality was under assault. The cryptids weren't just fleeing anymore. They were desperately trying to find refuge in our dimension before something worse consumed their own. Division 7's enhanced agents were being overwhelmed, their modified biology making them prime targets for these entities that fed on dimensional energy. The basement, Helena said. The real basement. That's where Marcus would have hidden it. We descended past the main research lab, past the specimen storage, past even the hidden communication center. At the lowest level, behind walls lined with more protective symbols than I'd ever seen, we found it. The master control unit looked deceptively simple, a device that combined ancient stone carved with impossible symbols and technology that shouldn't have existed yet. Uncle Marcus had built it based on the Elder One's instructions, designing it to interface with all the other nodes in the network. But there was something else in the room, something that made my heart stop. A mirror that didn't reflect the chamber but showed instead what existed between dimensions. And in those spaces, I finally saw them clearly, the entities that even the Elder Ones feared. Beings so vast and alien that their mere existence threatened to unravel the fabric of reality. They were beautiful, they were horrifying, they were coming. Choice must be made now, the Elder One's presence urged. Network ready, but activation requires sacrifice. Uncle Marcus's final notes explained what that meant. The network could seal our dimension, protect it from what was coming, but the cost was more than just isolation. It needed an anchor, a consciousness to maintain the barriers, someone to stand guard permanently in the spaces between spaces. That's why Uncle Marcus couldn't do it. That's why he'd prepared me all my life. The stars aligned, reality screamed. Through the network's communications, I heard the reports of final breaches worldwide. The entities were pushing through everywhere, consuming dimensional energy, breaking down the walls between worlds. Helena read Uncle Marcus's notes, understanding filling her eyes. You don't have to. Yes, I said, I do. I approached the master control unit. The mirror showed the truth of what was coming, an endless hunger that would consume not just our world, but all worlds, all dimensions, until nothing remained but void. Decide, the Elder One urged. Time ends. Above, the lighthouse beacon pulsed with impossible light. Around us, reality trembled as ancient entities pressed against the thinning barriers. The cryptids we'd studied, the mysteries we'd solved, even the Elder Ones themselves, all were just small players in a much larger cosmic drama. I placed my hands on the control unit. Uncle Marcus had built it to recognize his bloodline, to channel the same sensitivity to dimensional energy that had given me those childhood nightmares. Network status, I asked Helena. She checked the monitors. All surviving nodes report ready, quantum entanglement stable, reality anchor points aligned. Through the mirror, I could see them clearly now, vast forms moving through dimensions like leviathans through dark water, approaching the final barriers that separated their realm from ours. I thought of Uncle Marcus, of all he'd sacrificed to prepare for this moment. I thought of the network, of brave investigators around the world fighting to save a reality that didn't know it needed saving. I thought of the cryptids themselves, no longer monsters to be feared but refugees fleeing an apocalypse beyond human understanding. The choice was clear. I activated the network. Reality shifted. The master control unit hummed with power beyond comprehension. Through the mirror, I could see the barriers beginning to seal, not just around our dimension, but around all the dimensions that had sought refuge here. A new home, protected from the void that hungered beyond. But the price, my consciousness expanded, drawn into the spaces between spaces. I could feel every node in the network, every point where reality needed reinforcement. This would be my role now, eternal guardian, maintaining the walls between dimensions, protecting not just humanity but all the beings that had fled here seeking sanctuary. Helena's voice came from what seemed like a great distance. Nicholas, can you still hear me? I could, but I was more than Nicholas now. I was part of the network itself, spread across reality's foundations, keeping watch in the darkness between dimensions. Through the mirror, I watched as the hostile entities recoiled, frustrated by barriers they could no longer breach. Our dimension was sealed, not in fearful isolation, but as a sanctuary for refugees from realities already lost to the void. The cryptids would remain with us, no longer a secret to be hidden but allies in maintaining this last bastion of existence. The network would adapt, becoming guardians not just of humanity but of all the beings that now called our reality home. And I would watch over it all from the spaces between, maintaining Uncle Marcus's final gift to existence itself, a safe harbor in a cosmos more wonderful and terrible than humanity had ever imagined. This is how I became more than just a cryptid detective. This is how I became the guardian of what remains.